Okay, we're going to start. This is the last keynote of the day, and I'm delighted to welcome on stage James Purnell to come and talk to us. James, many of you may recognise him. James has a fair amount of Whitehall and Westminster experience, but he's not going to talk about that because he now has a strictly politically neutral role. After leaving government, James dabbled in the world of filmmaking, and now, lo and behold, the man has turned up as Director of Strategy and Digital at the BBC. We've already heard earlier from a speaker drawing parallels between the BBC as a large public sector organisation and the civil service. There are indeed parallels. James is going to talk to us about delivering change and strategy in a large public sector organisation. James, delighted to welcome you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and it's a real pleasure to be here. We actually spent a couple of very happy years when Richard was the chief lawyer at DWP. So I'm coming with a little bit of Whitehall experience, and I want to talk about how you do strategy in the public sector based on that, based on doing a bit of strategy at the Boston Consulting Group and a bit at the BBC in the 90s and now back at the BBC as Director of Strategy. I actually only really want to land one point, and I had a very depressing moment over lunch when someone made my point much better than I was going to make my point, so I'm just going to steal his way of making it and then give you my presentation anyway. But he was Canadian, and he's talking about a hockey player called Wayne Gretzky, who was asked why he was such a good hockey player. And he said, I always play where the puck is going to be rather than where the puck is at the moment. So he was always able to get ahead of the curve, whereas everybody else was still kind of focusing on where the action was at that particular moment. And for me, the key thing about strategy is making sure that you get ahead of the curve. You get to where the puck is going to be rather than where it is right now. Now, lots of people talk at length and very confusingly about strategy, and lots of things are written about strategy which I think are basically overcomplicate the subject and try and sort of show off people's knowledge rather than get to something that you can do something with. And so for me, my definition of strategy is actually incredibly simple. It's deciding what you're going to do and deciding what you're not going to do and then getting on with it. But a lot of the time when people talk about strategy, they actually either talk about it so much that they never actually end up doing anything at all. So you get analysis by strategy by analysis rather than strategy by execution. A more subtle way of getting strategy wrong is doing something which you think is a strategy, but which is actually only dealing with that puck right in front of you rather than where the puck is going to be. And the way that I always experienced this, and I experienced it at the BBC in the 90s, I still get it sometimes now in the BBC when projects go wrong, it used to happen with white papers sometimes, it happened at BCG as well, is that instead of doing this from objective down to problem down to means, it went the other way around. So you would have a white paper or a strategy which would be a list of initiatives, but it would be very hard to work out what the problem was that you were trying to solve. Quite often when you had worked out what the problem was, it wasn't clear how the initiatives, if they were achieved, would solve the problem. And perhaps even more worryingly, sometimes you'd be tackling a problem without actually worrying about whether it's a problem that was important or you wanted to fix in the first place. So for me, a really, really key thing about how to do strategy is to start from your objective, work out the problem you're trying to solve, and only then work out the policies or the means to solve it and work out whether together they will add up to solving that problem. Now that might sound incredibly simplistic, but it happened again and again at the BBC, in government, and I see it happening in the private sector as well. And I think a good illustration of this, and something I really want to say very clearly, is that for me this was never about people in the civil service, nor is it about people in the BBC. Actually, I might find it very frustrating when people say that the private sector is better than the public sector. That's never been my experience at all. I've worked with brilliant people all around both. But actually, the pensions white paper and the Turner Commission was a really good example for me of how strategy can go wrong. And the symptom of that was that actually you had broadly the same people who'd been working on the issue in government, then went to work on the independent Turner Commission. And before they went into the Turner Commission, they'd been coming up with things which sounded pretty good, which were good white papers, which ministers were happy with, like the stakeholder pension, for example. But actually, they were good launches and they were good initiatives, but they were never good solutions. Stakeholder pensions never really took off. And there are lots of reasons for why then when they went into the Turner Commission, it worked much better. One of them, I think, was genuinely that you had much better ministerial oversight. You had ministers and the 3 commissioners who were there for the long term, who were able to give very clear direction and who wanted a solution rather than a set of press releases. But I think the other problem, and this is a really fundamental one for me, is in a big organization, it's too easy to start from the constraints. So you start from, oh, well, the Treasury won't let us do it, or there's no money for this initiative, or in the case of pension reform, well, we can't do anything to employers because BIS won't let us. So you gradually, right at the start of the process, have a bunch of constraints drawn, which mean that in the end it's impossible to get to a solution. So all that you can ever come up with is initiatives. And I see that at the BBC today when we don't get it right, and I saw it in government as well. So for me, the fundamental problem that then happens is that you play the puck. We become absolutely brilliant at creating narratives to explain why there isn't a problem, or why the set of initiatives that we are implementing are going to solve the problem, even if we admit that there is one. So we become absolutely fantastic at telling ourselves comfortable stories about why we don't need to act right now, or why actually things are completely fine. And again, that's something that when we're not getting it right at the BBC, I see. We become fantastic at telling ourselves those stories until reality catches up, there's a crisis, and then we become very, very good at saying that actually we were pursuing the strategy which we end up with all along, and that was always our intention. So, as Richard said, it's a bit hard for me to illustrate that now because I'm politically neutral and I can't really talk about current political activities and challenges. So I was wondering about how I would be able to illustrate my point, and I thought actually the only way of doing it is to go back in time, to go back in history. So I'm going to try and illustrate it by talking about 2 people that were important in the 1930s and 1940s and 1950s in government, and hopefully that's far enough away that I can't be accused of anything which is politically controversial. So the first one is a man, very interesting man, called Frederick Lindemann. Frederick Lindemann was a German, but he was incredibly patriotic for Britain. He hated the Kaiser. He only had one eye, and despite that, he ended up playing at Wimbledon. He was a fantastic scientist. He was responsible for some of the early discoveries in nuclear science in Walter Nernst's laboratory. Even in his, this is in his very, very early 20s, he rubbed shoulders with Marie Curie and with Einstein. And then when the war broke out, he was in Germany. He beat a path back to the UK, where he'd grown up, and he tried to enroll, and they wouldn't let him. He wrote to the MOD. Eventually, he got into the Farnborough aircraft factory, and when he was there, he identified a problem that needed solving, and the problem was the following, as is mentioned up there. It was the Sopwith Scout plane was a brilliant radical innovation, but it had one fundamental design error, which is it would go quite often into a fatal spin. So it would spin towards the ground and become absolutely terrifying. People would try and pull on the stick to get out of the spin, and it never worked. They always crashed. So quite clear from my earlier schematic, quite clear from what the problem was, planes going towards the ground. The solution which the brass, the civil service in this case, came up with, the initial solution, was not so good. They were worried about losing so many planes, so they decided that the solution to that was not to give any parachutes to the pilots, and to hope that would incentivize them not to crash the plane. Didn't work very well. Planes kept on crashing. No one knew how to solve this, except for Frederick Lindemann, who suddenly worked out the physics of it, which was actually if you go into a spin, the worst thing to do is to pull out of the spin because it actually slows you down, and you therefore lose your ability to pull out of the spin. Actually, what you needed to do, counterintuitively, was to accelerate into the spin so that you were going faster, you'd be able to come out of the nosedive. Second problem was no one believed him, and even if they did, they certainly weren't going to experiment with it. So what did Frederick Lindemann do? he decided to learn to fly. So he taught himself to fly, flew deliberately put the plane into a spin 15 times, actually no, 25 times I think, came out every time and then eventually solved the problem. So for me this is an example of the civil service at its very best. Once there's a problem, the appliance of expertise and knowledge to the problem with courage and determination, that is something we do really well. Once we've worked out what the problem is, we're very, very good, much better than lots of other countries, at implementing the solution to it. This brought Lindemann to Churchill's attention. Churchill loved the idea that he had done this feat of sort of combination of intelligence and courage and adopted him as his kind of chief advisor. They went around Germany in the 1930s when Churchill was writing a book about the Duke of Marlborough, his ancestor, decided that Germany was becoming a threat, spent the rest of the 30s arguing against appeasement of Germany, very, very courageous, and obviously, as everybody knows, eventually won the argument if too late. So that was a great example of somebody trying to get ahead of where the puck was to where the puck was going to be and sticking to their beliefs and trying to argue to convince other people. So, my first point, very good at solving problems. That's something the civil service and the public sector does very well. Even better when you can get ahead of where the puck is going to be. My second person is someone called John Bennett, who's been largely forgotten by history, but he was rescued from the archives by a historian of the empire called Ronald Higham, and he was a brilliant civil servant. He went to Magdalen in Cambridge, got amazing exam results. Apparently these were the kind of results which only people like Eric Hobsbawm and Quentin Skinner got. But he was part of the first wave of grammar school boys and apparently was kind of passed over at Cambridge because he wasn't in the right public school social circles. So he decided to go to the civil service instead, did brilliantly in the civil service, had this incredible war career where he went all around the Middle East, and came back after the war and wrote what became, in retrospect, a very famous memo about what Britain's foreign policy strategy should be. And his strategy was very clear. He was basically saying, look, we no longer have the means to achieve our objective of maintaining the empire. We neither have the economic clout to be able to make it work, but more importantly, we no longer have the will. We are no longer prepared to repress rebellion in our colonies in the way that we did in the 19th century. And given that, we should accept that reality and develop a new strategy, which is get out of everywhere as fast as we can, and then rely essentially on the special relationship and on multilateralism. Now, how did that go down? Well, the junior minister who received it said that it was very stimulating and shelved it and didn't allow the Secretary of State to see it. It was quite bad. Slightly worse was the reaction of the Perm Sec. I'm sure no one would say this now. Sorry, Richard would never say that. And Bennett's diagnosis of his own problem was that he had introduced logic and morality into policy making, that he both wanted morality, a purpose, but also logic, the application of working out what your objective is, the problem, and the means to solve it. Now, people might say, well, actually, isn't this the policy that we ended up with? Didn't we end up going for the special relationship and decolonizing? Well, yes, we did. But actually, we only did so 10 or 15 years later. It's only really after Suez and the consequences of that we do actually go for decolonization. And although even the Labour government basically said that it agreed with some of this policy, actually, when you look at their revealed preference in places like Cyprus or in the Middle East, they were actually still trying to cling on as much as possible. And that is, for me, is the symptom of bad strategy. It's when you are constructing a story to tell yourself that what you're doing now is fine, rather than trying to get ahead to where that puck is. So my second example of where that went wrong is when actually Frederick Lindemann, who'd then been made Lord Charwell, he'd become a minister, actually becomes the villain of the piece. And this is in 1951. Britain is struggling economically. The pound is massively overvalued. It's still not convertible. We're trying to maintain imperial preference in the sterling area. And a group of very far-sighted, brave civil servants and people at the Bank of England, including Otto Clarke, who was Charles Clarke's father, who's kind of one of the famous treasury mandarins of his time, basically come up with this secret plan, which they call Robot, which is basically a way of floating the pound and allowing it to devalue a little bit so that it could become convertible. And the idea was, yes, there would be pain in the short term, but we would make our exports have to be competitive, and this would allow Britain to reach far wider markets than just the sterling area, and would give us the impetus to be competitive, and in particular would also protect our reserves. Brilliant plan. Terrible politics. They didn't tell anybody. They tried to bounce the Prime Minister into it. By making it a secret plan, they created lots of skepticism and doubt about what they were doing. And the person who finally put the nail in the coffin was Lord Cherwell, who's the same man, Frederick Lindemann, who basically writes a minute to Churchill saying, this is too much of a leap in the dark. It's a reckless leap in the dark, and if we stick resolutely to our current policy, we'll be absolutely fine. We just need to double down and be more determined. And again, that is the kind of the form of language, maybe not exactly these words, that I've come across again and again when people are trying to persuade themselves that actually everything is fine. If only we keep on going with the current policy, we will be okay. And so what happens? Well, exactly the same thing happens. In 1958, 7 years later, we're forced into making the pound convertible, but this time, A, we've lost almost a decade, and B, we no longer have the ability for the pound to float down. So rather than grasping our destiny and forming a strategy and getting to where the puck is going, we wait for the puck to get there, and then we post-rationalize the fact that we probably wanted to go there all along. And so for me, the key thing about strategy is trying to avoid doing that. It's trying to get there before the crisis forces you to do it. And as I said at the outset, I really don't like it when people say, oh, well, the private sector does this better than the public sector. But I do think there is one difference when you're doing strategy in the private sector, which is that the profit signal does give you a much harder reality to ignore. You know, if your profits are going down or if your share price is going down, it does force you to, you can ignore that reality for less long than you can in the public sector. And therefore, that puts even more of an onus on strategy to be the part of the organization that says, okay, I know we can keep on spending this money because it's coming in from taxpayers or from license fee payers, but actually, we're not going to be where the puck ends up, and we need to change now rather than wait for the crisis to force us to change and to give us the legitimacy to change. So that's the main point I wanted to land. I want to say just a few things about how you do that. So I've come up with slightly artificial 10 rules to do that. The first few are just the things I said at the start about doing objective problem means in order. Make sure your means are consistent and together add up to a solution to the problem that you've identified. You can have lots of good policies, but unless they're actually working to the right problem, they're not good policies. Use experts for their expertise. I mean, the Lindemann, Cherwell, his career is a great example of when it's great to have experts, when they know what they're talking about, physics. Less good when they suddenly are applying that knowledge to economics. You know, they've just happened to get proximate to someone who's got power, Churchill's power relay, as he said, but they actually don't know what they're talking about. So using expertise well in the right place is a key thing. It's actually also an interesting thing about Cherwell that he said about himself. He said the reason he never became a great scientist like the Curies and the Einsteins was that his brain was better at dismantling other people's arguments than building his own. And I think that's another thing to be beware of. Love the mavericks. Mavericks are great. But big organizations like the civil service or the BBC are terrible at using them. We're brilliant at sort of excluding them, pushing them to the margins, stopping them from speaking, not having them in ministerial meetings, not having them contribute to the memo. Actually, there's always someone in your organization who knows the answer. You just need to find them. And that is about loving, treasuring the mavericks and not ridiculing them before they've had the chance to speak. Don't let the constraints define the solution. Work out the solution first, and then work back how you can overcome the constraints. So in the case of the Turner Commission, you know, they worked out that the problem was we were under-saving. The solution was you had to have some compulsory contribution from employers. And rather than going, oh, well, we'll never get that through BIS, they worked out how they could create a package that was attractive enough for the CBI to sign up, so that once the CBI had signed up, the people in government who would be on that side would be happy with it. So don't let the constraints define the solution. Encourage candor. I had a real wake-up call when I went to BCG, and we were having our first project meeting, and a mixture of partners and me and some junior consultants in the room, and I was doing a little presentation on what I thought we should do. and this 23-year-old tore into my presentation and said it was rubbish. And the sort of ministerial DNA of me kind of went, who on earth are you to, it wasn't quite the wording I used in my head, but actually it was fantastic. And one of the great things that they did was to encourage a culture where actually you had to say the difficult thing in the room because you had to get to the right answer. And that is something that, again, big organizations are not great at. Build relationships, something which I think probably big organizations are better at, actually. But lots of these cases, both the Otto Clarke one and the John Bennett one, they were very bad at building the relationships with the people that they needed to make the decisions. In a funny way, John Bennett actually he quite enjoyed humiliating his superiors through the kind of memos that they would send around the Foreign Office, which would make him look good for a bit, but actually meant that he lost the war in the end. And then most importantly, maybe, and this is the bit that Lord Charwell teaches us, never give up. If you know that the answer is right, never give up, and make sure that you keep on fighting to get it accepted. And then very briefly, I don't want to make this an ad about the BBC, but how do we do that at the BBC? We always try and go from objectives rather than current means. So it would have been very, very easy in the 90s for John Burt to go, we are a TV business, corporation, this online stuff has nothing to do with us. But actually, the brilliant thing that he did was to go, we're here to inform, educate, and entertain, and we should be agnostic between TV, online, radio. If online can help us deliver it, then we should get ahead of that curve, even if it's a risk. I actually spoke to him the other day about how much risk it was, and he said it was a controlled risk, because actually he was only betting about 5% of license fee revenue on online, and therefore if it had gone wrong, it wouldn't have been a disaster. But even that within the organisation was quite difficult at the time, because what he did was he cut existing budgets to put money into this completely unproven thing, and there was an awful lot of resistance about, no one is using this, it's not going to work, it's not actually something that we should be doing. So we've always tried to get ahead of the curve, and always tried to make sure that we don't get stuck in the existing technology and the existing set of audience behaviours. We now, like you, are doing that with a declining budget. We've got to find actually slightly more than £500 million of savings in the next few years. Slightly lower levels of savings than the civil service average. We set ourselves a 20% target. Again, obviously higher for you. But we are doing that in a market where our competitors have got hugely grown revenues. So BT have gone from spending nothing on content, for example, to now spending £1 billion on content. And the big change of the 90s, in the 90s we used to try and understand what was happening over the next 20 years and understand audience and technology in depth. Now actually we don't try and predict anymore, we just try and keep up to date and understand the world as well as you can, don't get stuck in sort of analysis paralysis, make some big bets and then try and earn the permission to expand the ones that work and close down the ones that fail. And that is that is something that is a big, big challenge for us, I imagine for you as well. Actually, when we fail, people are pretty unforgiving. So we need to be able to convince people that it's just as okay to fail with a sort of technology initiative if it's done for the right reasons as it is for a program. We fail with programs every day of the week, and people understand that because it means that that's how we get good programs. And we need to be able to get the permission to make some big bets, still be confident about where you're going, because I think the other danger on strategy is you go completely into being flexible and adaptive, and then actually you don't have a direction. So you need to know where you're going, but be very flexible about how you get there, and not have 5-year plans. And then my one final slide, which is my only advert, which is actually what the BBC's done over the last few years by trying to stay ahead of the curve, is actually start to convince people that the license fee is better value for money. And 20 or 30 years ago, I think people would have thought that the license fee would be less popular now as people had more ability to buy what they wanted. Actually, the opposite has happened, that people are starting to think that the license fee is better value for money rather than worse.
Thank you very much. Now, we started a bit late, so we're a bit short of time, but we've probably got time for a couple of questions for James. I've immediately got one second row here. There's a microphone coming down to you, but yes.
Hi, Richard Welberg, Civil Service World. I wanted to ask, how do you think the civil service can maintain a long-term strategy given what is quite a short political cycle?
I think, is it a short political cycle? It's a sort of 5-year horizon, which is longer than most people would plan to. Ministers are now staying much longer in post, which I think is a very good thing. So that changes people's incentives. I mean, there was a a point under the last government when ministers were only really expecting to be there for a year or 18 months. Actually, that's changed now. I think that the hard thing to do is how you do strategy outside of a clear political framework. And so, but I don't think that's impossible. I think you can be thinking about, just to explain the point, it can become easy to default into, well, we're just here to work out the means, we're not here to set the objectives. And that's clearly true to a certain extent. But I think you can have goals for the country. You can have an idea of where the country wants to go and what matters within that, and therefore what the different options are for you. So, you could have nothing wrong with civil servants thinking about, well, do we want the economy to be more like a German sort of market economy, or more like a Singaporean economy, or more like a Australian economy, and still think about the options there, and therefore provide advice based on that kind of long-term strategy. Similarly with the pensions reform, that was civil servants providing that advice as well. So I don't think that just because you don't have political objectives doesn't mean you can't think long-term and be tough in trading off goals within that.
And I think a lot of the reforms and strategies we're talking about here, we've been talking about today, and in the hubs, are pretty durable. I would say politically, the need for the civil service to be smaller is certainly durable, more digital, more joined up, more unified. I can see that stuff surviving the term. It's a really interesting question about whether the fixed-term parliament, the 5-year framework, has increased medium-term planning and reduced short-termism. I think it probably has, although the coalition government's programme for government has helped as well. Let's have another question. First row.
I completely agree. I think the mistake that they made was they thought the only alternative to what they had was decline. They thought, okay, well, anything which is the alternative to empire is worse, and therefore we should just cling on to this for as long as possible. Actually, if they had had the ability to think, okay, we might no longer be an empire, but we could be a successful country in these particular ways, slightly in the way that Sweden did after the war, slightly in the way Germany did after the war, then actually they would have accepted the reality and made it better. And what happened again and again is Britain tried to cling on to what it had, then there was a crisis, and then it was very, very good at adapting to the crisis, but it was never really all that good at doing something before the crisis happened to avert it from happening in the first place.
That lady over there, in the middle aisle. Mic coming down to you from behind. No, there is a mic. Thanks.
I think a little bit of what that question was about, although I couldn't hear it so well, was perhaps when politics gets in the way of strategy. And I just wondered if you might give a few examples of your experience of perhaps when that happened, and perhaps some tips for us on how we could handle that.
I think it is partly about ministerial appetite. So if the minister isn't, if he or she isn't interested in that, then it's very hard to double guess them on that. But in my experience, there was always someone in the system somewhere who had an appetite for it. So it was about finding that. And I don't know, my candid view was when I came in, I had expected there to be more of the kind of legendary 5 or 10 page expert note saying this is where we should be going, this is what we should be doing. And whether because of ministerial demand or because of constraints, too often people ended up being beaten down into their own initiatives. And then when people would do a white paper, they would collect those initiatives together and try and put a narrative over it. And so actually I would, people, whether they're civil servants or politicians, people in the end come into politics to try and change the world in some way, and having a good strategy, whether they call it that or not, is what allows them to do that. So I guess it would be trying to find the people who've got the appetite for that, and then actually trying to lift into something which is an overall solution. So how do we get people saving more, rather than should we have stakeholder pensions? And so, so I would say find the right people and then provide them with the thing which is the overall solution, rather than the individual initiative.
And did you find the civil service had the culture which could tell you that actually you failed your first test, you had too many objectives and they were too contradictory and too woolly and you needed to focus on 2 or 3 of them? I mean, in a government with 109 ministers, it's potentially an awful lot of strategy could be chucked at the system. Is that?
Yeah, I think that's obviously harder in a department, but I found that the politicians were very bad at doing that. I mean, I would actually say it was more sort of, I found the civil service were quite often saying, look, you've given us 45 different things to do, which 2 do you want to do? And that was even bigger at the overall government level. And that's particularly the case when there isn't much money to spend, or when the Treasury, when there's no spending round, the people quickly default into let's set a target or let's set an overall goal. And actually you ended up with people setting lots of goals on child poverty, or on the 0.7% goal in DFID, or on being the best X in the world, without actually thinking about how all those added up together and whether we could afford them all at the same time. But in the end, that has to be the centre, saying these are the 4 things that we're going to do.
Well, we've got time for one more, if there is one. Yes, lady in green, has that hand up?
You're saying that strategy is about keeping ahead of the curve, but then, if I understood correctly, when you were referring to the BBC, you were saying that you'd sort of done away with 5-year plans, and when it comes to technology, it was sort of about keeping up. Is there a contradiction between the two, and how do you overcome that?
No, that's a really good question. So the danger of a 5-year plan now, with technology moving so fast, is you make your plan, and by the time, the 6 months between starting the process and writing it down, it's already out of date. And then the mistake, I think, that's often made is you therefore think, well, we should just be very adaptive. We should just try some stuff and see what works, and then we'll let the market tell us what the right answer was. And the problem with that is you end up, it's a bit like this, you end up being defined by the constraints. So you end up being buffeted by forces which are outside your control and fitting into them rather than controlling your destiny. So for me, the 5-year plan actually gets replaced by, in a way, a longer-term goal, which is, how would we like the world to be? And then a much shorter term implementation approach, which is about being much more flexible and just kind of setting yourself 6-month or 1-year goals, and then being able to revisit them very quickly and stop what's not working and continue what's working. Examples of people who do this, Google do this. Google have 2 operating systems, Android and Chrome, and they're just letting them compete against each other. We do it the whole time in terms of the long-term goal, and actually internet companies do this the whole time as well. Quite often they don't worry about how they're going to monetize their companies from the start. They try and identify the human need, and if you meet a human need, then somehow you'll find a way of making money out of it. And the equivalent for us for that is, okay, technology is changing media incredibly quickly. We should be confident that we can make the future as public service as the past. And once we're as confident that we can make on-demand be as public service and bring people together and sort of expose them to programs they wouldn't have naturally found. If we're confident we can do that in the new technology as well as we did in the old technology, then actually we'll set out and really try and make that work, rather than saying to ourselves that we're doing it, but actually slightly clinging to the old world and hoping secretly that it's going to stay as it is. So I think in a way you want to move both further forward and closer to you. So you both want to have a longer horizon, have a clear goal of what you'd like to happen, and then a much more flexible approach in the short term, and a greater willingness to kill things if they're not working.
James, thank you. I think unless I see another hand shooting up, I think I'm going to wrap it there because we're over time. James, thank you very much for coming and sharing those thoughts with us, particularly the parallels between the 2 organisations and the need to get the objectives absolutely rock solid, and everything flows from that. That was really interesting. Because this is not a closing session, but because it's the end of the conference, towards the end of the conference, can I just say, if you haven't written on the creative wall on the way out, please go and write your thoughts, some amazing things that you've seen today, things that you have learnt, things that you found really useful, confessions, whatever. Anyway, go and write on the creative wall. I see lots of people in white and pink T-shirts. Those are the people who've organised this amazing event. And although this is not the occasion to say thank you to, I would just like to say thank you very, very much to these events, to say the obvious, did not organise themselves. So maybe those of us who aren't wearing T-shirts can give them a clap. So thank you. I hope you've really enjoyed the day. I've really enjoyed it. Several of the team are going to be in Bristol tomorrow for the third leg of our tour. I'll just finish by saying what I said right at the beginning of the day. Just remember that the best thing you read or heard or spoke about today, the best thing, and be as good as that thing when you go back to your office. Talk about it, tell people about it, tweet about it, be exceptional as the hashtag. Thanks very much for coming. Thank you, James.